Evening, everybody. My name is Dolores O'Riordan, and I'm the Director of UCD's Institute for Food and Health. I'm delighted that you can join us this evening for UCD's Institute of Food and Health Public Lecture Series. Now, this series is designed to give you the scientific facts about food matters on topics where often the message can be a little bit confusing from popular media sources. And our lecture this evening is on the topic of meat as part of a balanced diet. And this is certainly a topic where we hear many conflicting opinions. Tonight, you're going to hear from experts in the field of meat science with input from our nutrition and dietetic team as well, who between them have decades of research experience in the area. Now, an important part of the public lecture series is to provide you, the public, with an opportunity to ask questions, and we will endeavour to answer them at the end of the session. So please keep dropping in your questions in the Zoom Q&A function during the course of the talk, and we'll have time at the end to look at these questions. That session will be moderated by my colleague, Professor Lorraine Brennan, and I'll hand over to Lorraine now, who will introduce the speakers for this evening. Thanks very much. Over to you, Lorraine.
Thank you very much, Dolores. And this evening, it gives me a great pleasure to introduce my colleagues, Frank and Claire. So we're going to start off with a lecture from Frank, and then Claire is going to join Frank at the end for the Q&A session. Frank Monahan is a professor of food science at UCD. His research interests are primarily in the area of meat science, where he's particularly interested in the impact of on-farm animal production factors, including the diet of the animals and on the composition and quality of meat. In the area of food authentication, he's investigating methods to determine the geographical origin and dietary background of meat and dairy products, with a particular interest in grass-fed products. He's responsible for teaching meat science to undergraduate and postgraduate students here in UCD. As I mentioned, at the end, Frank is going to be joined by Claire for the Q&A session. And Claire is a registered dietitian and associate professor of clinical nutrition and dietetics in UCD. She manages the CORU approved MSc in clinical nutrition and dietetics. She is the former president of the Irish Nutrition and Dietetic Institute, the professional body for dietitians in Ireland, and a former chairperson of the Irish section of the Nutrition Society, the Learned Society for Nutritionists and Nutritional Scientists in the UK and Ireland. So I'm going to hand over now to Frank, who's going to start off with his lecture.
Great, thank you very much, Lorraine and Dolores. And everybody for joining in this evening. I'm delighted you could all attend this evening's public lecture on meat as part of a balanced diet. So in the course of this evening's presentation, these are some of the topics I'm going to cover. I'm going to look at meat in the context of the dietary guidelines, what meat contributes in terms of nutrition, a bit about meat composition. People often ask about the difference between red and white meats, the quality of meat protein, a bit about processed meats, meat alternatives, meat and cancer, which is a question people often have, what the situation is in Ireland with regard to meat intake currently, and then the take-home messages at the end. So just to begin, I think a very good starting point is to draw your attention to the food pyramid. I'm sure all of you are aware of it. And it's really useful to go to the HSE website where there are various versions of the food pyramid with increasing detail from the simple version right down to the professional version. And I suppose I'll take some of the material from the professional version in the course of this evening's presentation. There's also a really good food shelf fact sheet, so more detail about what's on each shelf of the pyramid in terms of what foods constitute the foods on that shelf, but also how they should be cooked and prepared and so on. So if we look at the pyramid, meat is on the second shelf down from the top, if we ignore the top part there. And from that shelf, we're advised to take 2 servings per day. And you can see this extra level of detail on the right and left about what those servings should be. So I'm just going to say a little bit about those now on the next slide. So in terms of this shelf, what's on it is meat, the subject of tonight's presentation, poultry, fish, eggs, beans, and nuts. And the foods on this shelf are a very good source of protein particularly. But with regard to meat, the advice is to choose lean meat and poultry meat without the skin, and fish, to eat oily fish up to twice a week, but also to choose eggs, beans and nuts as part of the foods on this shelf, and to limit processed salty meats such as sausages, bacon and ham. And if we then look at what a serving is in each case, it's 50 to 75 grams of cooked lean beef, lamb or pork, mince or poultry. So that's about half the size of the palm of your hand. If you exclude the fingers and thumb and you take the width of the hand, but also the depth. So one serving is about half the size. So 2 servings would obviously of meat would be the full size of the palm of your hand if you were to take the 2 servings from the meat category in a day. It's about 100 grams of cooked fish, 3/4 of beans, 2 eggs, or the unsalted nuts and seeds. So these each constitute a serving. So just going to the actual fact sheet, again, you can see the information I've just given you here, but it also gives some information about, you know, again, as I said, lean meats, the limiting of the processed meats, but also some ways of cooking. So for example, using as little oil or fat as possible to cook, eating the fish, as I said, and also just ways to use meat with vegetables particularly, so to increase your vegetable intake by using meat creatively with vegetables. So meat contributes, as I said already, high quality protein. I'll come back to this high quality bit in a couple of minutes. It also contributes some fat and polyunsaturated fatty acids, including omega-3 fatty acids. We get those from meat. Meat is also a very good source of iron, particularly red meat, and it's iron in the absorbable heme form. So it's more easily absorbed into our bodies, and it's also a good source of zinc, and also of a number of micronutrients, riboflavin, niacin, the B vitamins 12 and 6 and 12, and of vitamin D. So people often ask, well, what is the difference between red meat and white meat? And the first obvious difference, obviously, is the color, and that is the case that we categorize red meats as those with the dark red color, so beef, lamb and pork, and white meats obviously would be the poultry meats, fresh chicken and turkey. The color comes from myoglobin, and again you can see here why that is. Beef has a high myoglobin content in milligrams per kilogram. Chicken has a much lower content, and so in terms of iron, obviously beef would be a very good source of iron in the diet. Lamb and pork are in between. It's also interesting just to look at the composition overall of meat from different sources. And on this slide, there's just a couple of things to pick out. One is that, you know, fresh meat is 75% water by and large. The next component in terms of the quantity of it in meat is protein. So meat is about 20% protein, lean meat is, and going right down to fish. What's important though is, in terms of fat, is that it can vary from meat cut to cut. So sometimes, you know, people say, well, beef or pork is very high in fat, but it depends on the cut, and that chicken is low in fat. So if you look at some beef cuts are very low in fat, chicken thigh tends to have more fat than chicken breast muscle, and so on. And obviously, if you take a cut of meat with the adhering fat, so for example, a pork chop with the fat attached, it could be as much as 30% fat. And obviously, if the fat goes up, the quantity of you know, moisture and protein goes down from that cut of meat. And in relation to fish, again, the fat content varies. The oily fish, salmon and mackerel, tend to have more fat, obviously, than fish such as cod. Meat has little or no carbohydrate, and the remaining constituent is ash, which is basically the minerals and so on that remain. One of the important things to look at, though, is not just the quantity of fat in foods generally, but in this case in meat particularly. We know that fat, and all of you will be familiar with this, it can be categorized as saturated, monounsaturated, or polyunsaturated. And this is where the meats differ in terms of the composition of the fat. So beef and lamb tends to be higher in saturated fat. The fish is lower in saturated fat, with pork and chicken being in between. And then on the other hand, polyunsaturates tend to be lower in beef and lamb and higher in the fat from the fish. But not only that, another important part of it is the omega-3, particularly in omega-6 fatty acids, and the content of those within the different meat fats and fish fats. So fish is a very good source of omega-3 fatty acids, particularly the long chain fatty acids, DHA and EPA. The other meats have some, but just not as much. And they all have omega-6 fatty acids. And in our Western diets, what has happened over the years is that the ratio of omega-3 to omega-6 has gone down. And so that's why we're advised to consume fish at least twice a week to increase our omega-3 fatty acid content. It doesn't mean we don't need omega-6s, we do, but we just need to shift the balance towards omega-3s. The other question people often ask is about moving on from the fat to protein. And first of all, if we just look at the amount of protein in meat, as I said already, in fresh meat, it's about 20%. When you cook the meat, you lose some water. So if we look at chicken and beef here, the fat content in the cooked meat is, over 30% in beef and chicken. And then if we just go down through the foods, you can see that it's a little bit lower for fish, eggs. Milk is about 3.5% fat, and then various vegetable and plant sources of protein here are a little lower. But it depends on the product. So for example, if you were to consume cheese, obviously, you will have more protein per 100 grams. But I suppose the message here is that meat is a good source of protein in terms of the protein content. It's dense in protein. But the other important thing is the quality of the protein. And there is a scoring system for food proteins called the PDCAAS scoring system. And that looks at the range of amino acids that the proteins in foods provide us with. And you can see here that chicken, tuna, eggs, milk are all up at 100, indicating they're complete protein sources in that they provide all the essential amino acids to us. Beef's a little lower, but it's about 95, I think, very close to 100. And plant sources are often lower, score lower, because they are limiting in one or more of the essential amino acids. That doesn't mean you can't get the essential amino acids from these sources. You can. You just need to make sure that you consume a balance of protein sources to make sure you get all of the amino acids, so you don't depend on one protein source for your amino acids. So there are two important points to make about the meat protein. It's high in meat, but also it's a good source of the amino acids, the essential amino acids that we need in our diets. So what I've said so far has been about fresh meats. I want to say something now about processed meats. And processed meats can be defined as meats that are not sold fresh, but they've been cured, salt, smoked, or preserved in some way. So for example, we'd all be familiar with bacon, sausages, hot dogs, salami, pepperoni, ham, and so on. And many of these products, as you know, are manufactured from pork or beef, but they can also contain other red meats, or indeed poultry or offal such as liver, or meat byproducts such as blood. But it does not include fresh burgers or mince. So when you mince meat to make burgers, or just simply to use it as mince, nothing has been added, so it's basically the same as the fresh meat. So it's not classified as processed by virtue of being minced in that way. So one of the things I often do with students is say, have a look at the labels, because the labels tell an awful lot about the story of how meats are processed, what's in them, and so on. And you can inform yourself by looking at the labels. So I'm just going to do that with a few examples now, and that helps to explain, what the processing involves. So here I've got labels for two sausages on the market currently. So we take the one on the left here, it's got 53% Irish pork is what the label says, some pork fat. I've just highlighted a few ingredients in green to draw to your attention. So sausages contain rusk, which is carbohydrate, a wheat source in this case. They also contain water, the second ingredient, and salt. Phosphates are often there, and they're there to hold in the water. They have to bind the water that's been added during the manufacture of the sausage. Sulfite is an antimicrobial agent, vitamin C, ascorbic acid, and then they also contain a color, carmine, and they're packaged into a casing. In this case, it's a beef collagen casing. The product on the right is higher in pork. Again, it has water as the second ingredient. It has salt, and it has the phosphates to bind water. The sulfite is there, the vitamin C, and the color. So, when you look then at the nutritional information associated with these, that very much reflects the ingredients. So you can see, for example, the product on the right is much higher in protein, 18% or 18 grams per 100 gram in the fresh or uncooked product, 11 grams in the one on the left, reflecting the lower pork and meat content. And the calorific value is different as well. It's lower in the one on the right because it has lower fat as well. You can see it's about just over 11%, 11.5%, whereas it's 29% in this product. So again, these would be the typical ingredients used in the manufacture of sausages, and I hope I've given you some idea of why these ingredients are there and what they do. But the product quality and composition varies very much depending on what ingredients are used. Another example I often use is of ham, and you can often tell just by looking at the ham through the pack what the quality is. So the one on the left has probably more water added. It's got shinier appearance, looks a bit more processed. This one here has a bit more of the muscle structure present. And again, if we look at the labels on products such as this, the one on the left has 82% pork. Again, water is the second ingredient, salt and some sugar, phosphate again to bind the water. And one of the key ingredients in the manufacture of ham, of course, is nitrite or nitrate. Both can be used depending on the product. And if we look at the product on the right here, we can see again pork, salt, sugar, phosphates, and so on. But what's interesting here is that water isn't listed. And while water will be used in both products to get the salts and other ingredients into the product, in this case, the water is cooked out during cooking, so it's not declared. And also what's telling about this one is it says that 115 grams of raw pork was used per 100 grams of finished product, again, indicating weight loss during the cooking. So this is going to be a higher value product, the one on the right. And again, when you look at the nutritional information, it reflects the ingredients. The protein content of the one on the right is higher, and there's a big difference in price as well. So you're paying more for the one on the right, but it has more protein, and that would probably be the main difference. Otherwise, the ingredients are quite similar. And again, this is, I suppose, a product with very few ingredients. It's a chorizo product. You can see it's just pork, paprika, salt, and garlic. Again, 134 grams to yield 100 grams. So a lot of water lost, in this case, in the drying process, and that concentrates the protein and fat in the product. So again, this is a high fat product and about 20% protein. High salt because water has been lost during the drying of the product. So this is a product, that's had a high calorific value. So you probably wouldn't eat 100 grams of this, but you'd eat a smaller amount, bearing in mind, the nutrients that it's providing you with. And I just wanted to touch a little bit on meat-free alternatives tonight because they're very much present now, and there's a great increasing awareness of them. And I just picked up a few labels from products, a meat-free chorizo, moving on from the previous product, and a meat-free sausage. And you can see in both cases, the first ingredient is water, and then the source of protein and texture, I suppose, in the product is pea protein in the case of the chorizo. The fat comes from coconut oil, and then there are spices and various other ingredients. And in the case of the sausage, it's wheat flour, so providing some protein as well as carbohydrate, and soy protein, wheat gluten, again a protein source, and other ingredients. And coconut oil, again, is the fat source in this product. And again, the labels reflect what's in the ingredient list. So compared to the regular chorizo, this is obviously much lower in fat, almost 10%. These products are higher in fiber because of the ingredients that are used. They've carbohydrate in them coming from the ingredients used in the product, about the same amount of salt as regular products. And the same applies to the meat-free sausage, similar sort of profile. But these tend to be, lower in protein than your regular meat products. So again, that's where the protein quality comes into play. This is 9% protein, the lower one here. This has 13% with our plant proteins. And just finally, meat-free mince, again, one on the market. This is made from rehydrated, so you have the water there, soy and wheat protein, some soybean oil in there as well, and coconut oil is the fat source, so giving the fat that you can see here in the product. And again, when you look at the nutritional information, again, reflects the ingredients. Fat content is probably not all that different to regular mince, depending on what quality of meats used to make the mince, but it is a different fat source, of course. And again, there's fiber here, which you wouldn't have in regular mince, coming from some of the ingredients that are used. So I want next to move on to another question that is often asked, and that's around meat and cancer. Again, the students often ask this here in UCD, and for many years this has been a topic of conversation. So this title here comes from a paper in 2015, which was published by the IARC, World Health Organization. And at the time, they classified processed meats as carcinogenic and red meats as probably carcinogenic. So very strong wording. This was it here, the red meats classified as probably carcinogenic with a 17% increased risk. And this was relating to bowel cancer per 100 grams per day of the product, and processed meats 18% per 50 grams per day. I put the references at the bottom. And then more recently in the UK, this study here, where they looked at 500,000 people, 21 grams versus 76 grams per day of red and processed meats. And again, the same sort of figure, 20% higher risk of colorectal cancer, 18% for red meat, 19% for processed meats. And the quantities actually they attributed it to were smaller than those in the Bouvard et al. Paper in 2015. So these numbers, 17, 18, 20%, are high, but it's about how these are interpreted, and coinciding with this information, these publications, there was also a lot of commentary on how they were interpreted, particularly those figures of 17, 18 to 20%. And you can see here an Irish Times article following the 2015 report, and then more recently a Journal of Medical Ethics blog, again about how the data is reported in the media. And I just want to follow on from this then, just to explain what it means for us as consumers of processed meats. So this is a comment from a professor of public understanding of risk at Cambridge, following the 2015 publication. So in the normal run of things, around 6 in every 100 people would be expected to get bowel cancer in their lifetime. And interpreting the data then, if all of these 100 people ate a 3-rasher bacon sandwich every single day for the rest of their lives, there would be an 18% increase. And that means the cases would go from 6 to about 7. So that's one extra case of bowel cancer in all those 100 lifetime bacon eaters. So it's a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but it does, I think make it real what this means. 6 cases go to 7. That's what the 18% increase means. And in relation to the study last year, again, just following up on that a bit, they looked at different groups in their 500,000 people and the level of consumption of processed and red meats per day. So one group consumed 21 grams per day. The incidence in that group over the average of, I think, almost 6 years of the study was about 40 cases per 10,000 people of bowel cancer. With the higher level consumption, that goes up to 48. And again, that's the 20% increase in risk that is a result of the study. So that's what the 20% means. And of course, it is about consumption per day. So it's about consuming this amount every day of processed and red meats. And the question is, do we consume that much, and do we consume these red meats every day? And following on really from the comment on the previous slide. And if you look at, this is taken from the Irish records for colon cancer. Again, the top risk factors are actually genetic, family history, tobacco, smoking, alcohol, body fatness, and then red and processed meat is a risk factor. But it's not the only one. So I suppose the message is eating processed meats or red meats is not the only factor contributing to colorectal cancer. And again, just this is taken from one of the authors actually of the IRC WHO report in 2015, Kurt Strafe, and just putting it in context again, the number of cancer deaths and what in world globally and what they're attributable to. So you can see, this is tobacco smoke, alcohol, air pollution, then processed and red meats. So it's not to say there isn't a risk, but it's just to put it in context. So I hope I've done that in the last couple of slides. And then in terms of, the actual recommendations, the World Cancer Research Fund recommends consuming less than 500 grams of red meat per week, and little, if any, of it to be processed. In the UK, the Scientific Advisory Committee on Nutrition recommends limiting red and processed meat consumption to no more than 70 grams per day. And the FSAI in Ireland, again, just doesn't give a figure, but it says that processed meats and sausages should be limited. And that's, often around the salt intake and the fat intake, because some products have, high fat content, as we saw from the labels. So this is just some data on what meat actually contributes to the diet of Irish people. And this is from publications of colleagues here in UCD and UCC. So meat contributes about 17% to our protein intake, our daily protein intake, 70% of our energy, 23% of our total fat, saturated fat. I mentioned already the polyunsaturates, monounsaturates, and also, of course, the B12, about 31% of it, vitamin D, iron, zinc, and sodium. So it can make a valuable contribution to our diets. And then going back to that earlier slide about the fat, it's important to look at the fat content of both fresh and processed meats, and also the saturated fat, so that we consume a variety of food, but indeed meat and fish sources and plant sources to get variable levels of our fats in terms of polyunsaturates, omega-3s, and so on. And then just looking at what the intake of meat actually is per day here. So the previous slide was about the nutrition, the nutrients we get from meat. Overall, for men and women, it's about 134 grams per day. And of that, 52 and 34, so that's about 86 grams per day is of red and processed meat with the current data. And it's higher for men than women. So if you think of that figure of 86, and then we look back at the dietary guidelines, where does it fall on those? So again, just looking at the center part of this, a serving is 50 to 75 grams. That's half the size of the palm of your hand. So we're consuming a little bit more than one portion, and depending on how you look at this, close to 2 portions or 2 servings as meat, 2 servings of the foods on that second shelf of the pyramid. So we're within the recommendation, or a little bit more than it, but obviously we're not taking foods from other sources on the shelf. So we're not taking the beans and lentils, the eggs, the fish actually. And again, the recommendation is to take at least 2 servings of fish per day. So I want to conclude then just by saying, that meat can be part of a balanced diet. It's there in the food pyramid that we should adhere to, and we should adhere to those dietary recommendations. I think it's important to read the labels in making choices, particularly around the processed meats, and moderating our consumption based on the fat content of those products, the protein in them, the salt in them, particularly. And with that, I just want to thank you for listening, and both Claire and I are now happy to take some questions.